the most famous photograph in the history of aviation, the Wright Brothers First Flight, December 17th, 1903, near Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. How do you do? I am Paul Garber. It is my privilege to be the Historian Emeritus for the National Air and Space Museum at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington. And I'm pleased to bring you another of the series on the history of flight, part 2 of the Wright brothers. I want to emphasize the significance of this wonderful photograph. This occasion that you are seeing was the first time in the history of the world that a machine heavier than air, not a balloon, not an airship, heavier than air, carrying a man, had risen from the ground under its own power, had flown forward under control, without reduction of speed, and had landed without wreckage at a point equally as high as that from which it had started. Now, that very excellent definition of what constitutes true flight is the best setting forth of the principles that constitute practical aviation. 4 flights made that day of December 17, 1903. The first, with Orville at the controls, was for 12 seconds, a distance of about 120 feet, 10 feet per second. The second by Wilbur, about 175 feet. The third by Orville, the brothers alternating, was a similar distance. But the fourth by Wilbur was 852 feet in 59 seconds. He really got up and flew that thing. But in the landing, which was abrupt, nobody had ever flown an airplane before. There were no books on this, no training lessons. They had to teach themselves. And each flight ended as a wingtip would touch some little bit of ground. But in that landing by Wilbur, there was some damage. And they took the aircraft back to the hangar, and there had taken off the front elevator member, and were going to repair it. Now, the wind was very strong that day, 27 miles an hour. And as they were talking about the flight and working on this repair, the wind got under those wings, and all of a sudden the aircraft was raised up and then over and then over and over and over, just like a box kite with a broken string. And it was impossible to repair it at that time, so the brothers decided to pack up and go on home in time for Christmas. But first, they wanted to send a telegram to their father. In fact, they'd planned to fill the gasoline tank all the way and fly over to the telegraph station. But they walked over, and there they did send this telegram. Success. 4 flights Thursday morning, all against a 21-mile wind, actually 27. Started from the level with engine power alone, average speed through the air 31 miles. Longest 57 seconds, really 59. Informed the press, home Christmas, signed by Orville Wright. In the summertime, you see the air doesn't have the buoyancy, doesn't have the depth, the body, as it does in the winter. So summer air didn't have the same strength. And thus the Wright brothers decided they needed more push to get off the ground. So they contrived a catapult. Now over here at the right, you see that tower. That tower had a weight that was pulled up to the top. I can show that better in a drawing. And thank you. Here at the top of the tower was that heavy weight, and then a line on that weight went up to the top over a pulley, down that front leg, way over here to your left, over the end of the track where there was another pulley, and then the line went to the front of the airplane. Then you see, when the weight came down, the airplane was pulled forward and thus into the air. Now that was first tried on September the 4th of 1904. There's Wilbur up there attaching the fittings for the pulley tackle, and there's the heavy weight there on the ground. Now, actually, this picture was taken a few years later, but it shows what I'm trying to illustrate. The use of this catapult for takeoff. We all know today you've got to have more gun to get off the ground than you do to stay up there. So in 1904, they made 105 flights, the longest over 5 minutes. That was on September 20, when for the first time they flew out and back. Now these others I spoke of, these other experimenters over there in Europe, they'd made little bounces off the ground, but in a straight line. But the Wright brothers there on September 20 flew out and back in big circles and in figure eights, gaining good control of this aircraft. The next year, 1905, they flew for more than half an hour, a flight of 24.2 miles in 38.5 minutes. This was such an excellent accomplishment that the Wright brothers then wrote to the War Department and said, well, we've perfected an airplane that we'd like to demonstrate to you. We think it has military possibilities. We'd be very pleased to show it to you. The War Department paid no attention, just sent them a form letter saying that, well, it wasn't at all helpful, just saying that demonstrations had to be given. The Wright brothers had already asked for that. But here, they did receive their patent in 1906. They'd applied for it in 1903. And this patent is another thing I want to emphasize to you. This was not merely a patent for lift. Aircraft had been lifting since the first kite 3,000 years ago. Things had been steering since the Chinese put a rudder on a boat, maybe another 3,000 before that. But the patent of the Wright brothers was for the combination of balance, lateral balance, and the control of yaw. Yaw is that tendency of an aircraft to sort of slew around in flight. But by the addition of that rear vertical surface and the manipulation in connection with lateral balance, the Wright brothers did develop the basic elements of true flight. And there, this photograph, quite retouched, was taken by Jimmy Hare of Collier's Magazine. And the article by Byron Newton described how these Wright brothers actually did fly. Those reporters lay there sort of in ambush. The Wright brothers knew they were there, but the reporters didn't know the Wright brothers did. And they took this picture, and they made this drawing, which shows that for the first time, they were sitting up. And there, also for this first time, is a passenger carried in an airplane. The passenger is Charlie Furness, one of the Wright brothers' mechanics. And these flights were very helpful in regaining their skill, teaching a new method of control. You recall that previously they had lain prone. And so with this new experience, this new practice, Wilbur then went to France. Here is the aircraft repaired, brought out, the rear rudder put on, the front elevator put on, all ready for these demonstrations. Now these were to take place at Le Mans. Le Mans is about 30 miles, I was told, outside of Paris. Later they went down to Pau, which was a warmer section of that country. But here's Wilbur. He's got those beams, those 2x4s, maybe that's a 2x6, that he's going to lay in a line for that launching track. And then he's going to climb up there in the tower, make that all rigged up, get that ready for the weight. Here he is fixing up the lines by which the aircraft is to be catapulted into the air. And then the aircraft was brought out, placed upon the track. There it is, being moved out. Now we have a wonderful motion picture here, the first ever made of an airplane in flight. And I'm so pleased that through the help of National Archives and this wonderful crew here in the Navy, the two Jims, that we can show it to you. There's Wilbur putting a wheel under that wing, a wheel under the other wing, and thus it is just rolled over the ground. Those wheels were just for temporary use. Now here's a working party. In fact, persons later considered it a great honor to help pull that weight up. There's a passenger seated, because you see Wilbur was going to take passengers over there also and teach persons to fly, starting the engine by getting those propellers on compression, and then down she goes, and there goes the weight, and there goes the aircraft, and into the air. There were hundreds, thousands of persons came to see these flights. These were astounding. They were the greatest news of the day, just as later on we had the news of the trip up there to the moon. And these flights, about 35 miles an hour. Well, a short film, but very impressive. A motion picture film was made in Italy, including a portion taken with a camera located directly behind the pilot and showing his manipulation of the front control. Here's the hangar Many, many persons came to see these wonderful flights, the airplane coming out, being moved on temporary wheels that are placed under the wing so it can be rolled to the starting rail. You recall that this long starting rail was part of a catapult system by which the airplane was given its initial velocity to supplement the power of the engine. There's Wilbur, just at the left for a moment. The front end of the airplane is to the right, a bit confusing because today the tail is at the back. Propellers, you see, are at the rear. The engine started by cranking both props, pulling down on the outside blade. There's Wilbur with one of his passengers. He carried about 20 passengers during the 40-some flights that he made there near Rome. Along the starting rail and into the air. A wonderful wide-open area, quite historic because in some of these scenes you can see the old Roman aqueducts in the distance. Around and around that huge field, there's those aqueducts. The speed about 40 miles an hour, altitude, as you see, about 75 to 100 feet, sometimes about 150. The camera was hand-cranked, and so the speeds will seem to vary as the operator may have gotten a bit tired turning that crank all the time. Here he's going to give the cameraman a pretty close shave. Large number of officers there. There's Orville with that straw hat on. Balloons were used at that time by a number of armies. Airplane under perfect control. Now we're going to get a real, there goes your hat, real thrill. You notice how the airplane seems to sort of hunt up and down. Of course, close to the ground there are air currents that are sometimes rather bumpy. Another approach. Speed, as I say, about 40 miles an hour. The revolutions of the propeller will seem to vary in the movie. See how slowly they seem to go, but that's because of the synchronization with the motion picture film. About 350 RPM. Now, you're just about to see, for the first time ever taken, movies during an airplane in flight with a camera mounted behind the seats, pointing out forward between the pilot and passenger. Now, along the rail, a very interesting thing here is that string that's tied to that upright stick there. You see it every now and then more clearly than at others. Now, that is an instrument. Today we have hundreds of instruments on our control panels, but that string was just about the first instrument. And as it waved toward the pilot, he could tell whether he was climbing or descending by the way that it would fly sort of upward or downward. And if it sort of waved to one side or another, he knew he was drifting, either right or left, or had a cross current. So it's a darn good instrument. Very simple and quite informative to the pilot. There's some of those aqueducts in the distance. Notice how the airplane seems to go up and down with constant manipulation of that elevator in front. That's one of the features of those types that have the elevator in front. Wilbur made 42 flights in Italy, including a number with passengers. Thanks to a motion picture photographer who went from the Department of Agriculture, carrying his large wooden boxed Edison camera over there, we have this first motion picture made in America of an airplane. Now, that's not the airplane in the foreground. That large object is President William Howard Taft. Weighed about 320 pounds. And he was accompanied by a number of his cabinet, ambassadors, officials of government. Just about everybody would go over there to see these flights. I read about them in the paper, and I'm so glad that I went over the following year. This is in 1908, however, that you're seeing now. Or not 1909, 1909 this is, yes. You can always tell the difference by the higher landing gear. Now, Orville will be coming along in just a moment. Hurry up, Orville. There he goes. And here he is with his passenger, Lieutenant Lahm, Frank P. Lahm. The date is July 27 because that was the date of the endurance flight, the one that I saw. Orville ducked under all those wires to get into his seat. Now, just beneath him, there's a thing that a sailor calls a pelican hook. It's a means whereby a tension can be released to let the airplane go forward. There's Wilbur with that straw hat on, Charlie Taylor in shirt sleeves. That's the catapult tower. A heavy weight, 1,200 pounds, is to be hoisted up to the top of the tower. There's the men pulling on the line. Up goes the weight, and Wilbur gives it a push with his cane. Now as that weight comes down, with the engine running, a line fastened to the weight and extending out to the end of this rail and back to the airplane. The weight comes down, the line pulls, the airplane goes forward and into the air. The flights were made around the field. Orville had said that that was quite the smallest field he'd ever flown in. Of course, down there to Kitty Hawk, they had all the Atlantic seaboard, and out in Ohio, they had the whole flat state. But here, they were limited on one side by a cemetery wall, not a very cheerful barrier, and then the horse stables for the artillery and cavalry were over there on the right side, as you see. Speed, about 40 miles an hour. Propeller RPMs, about 350, similar to the airplane flown by Wilbur in France and in Italy. The method of landing was to reach overhead and pull a wire which stopped the compression of the engine, and then you sort of skid on in to a landing. How do you do? I am Paul Garber. It is my privilege to be the Historian Emeritus for the National Air and Space Museum at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington. And I'm pleased to bring you another of the series on the history of flight, part 2 of the Wright Brothers. The most famous photograph in the history of aviation, the Wright Brothers' First Flight, December 17th, 1903, near Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. I want to emphasize the significance of this wonderful photograph. This occasion that you are seeing was the first time in the history of the world that a machine heavier than air, not a balloon, not an airship, heavier than air, carrying a man, had risen from the ground under its own power, had flown forward under control, without reduction of speed, and had landed without wreckage at a point equally as high as that from which it had started. Now, that very excellent definition of what constitutes true flight is the best setting forth of the principles that constitute practical aviation. 4 flights made that day of December 17, 1903. The first, with Orville at the controls, was for 12 seconds, a distance of about 120 feet, 10 feet per second. The second by Wilbur, about 175 feet. The third by Orville, the brothers alternating, was a similar distance. But the fourth